Okay, take three, because I don't always talk the best, and sometimes I need to add little details to my little script that I'm reading off from here today. So, welcome back to Critical Weight Theory, where I sometimes think out loud, and it's a show where ideas meet reality and culture gets interrogated a little bit sometimes. I hope to sometimes have fun with things, but also make people think along the way. And today's episode is all about something you think you know, fairy tales, language, and how we learn to be who we are. Now, as I talk about fairy tales, I'm not trying to cancel them or saying they're all bad or all good or all whatever. I'm just encouraging people to think about them, really. And if you have kids who ask questions about stories, you might want to take the questions a little bit seriously while also reminding them and yourself that they are also just stories, even if in some ways we actually treat them as more than just stories, as I will get into more as I discuss and elaborate. So, the fact that we treat them as just stories but also as something that's a little bit serious, it's a little bit contradictory, right? I know it's a little bit of a nuanced topic unto itself, but it's not really my contradiction. It's more like it's life's contradiction. You know, the complexity of it all. Anyway, let's start with a familiar image. A child curled up listening to Cinderella, for example. It seems innocent enough, right? But what if these stories were more than just bedtime entertainment? What if they were actually tools, not just for imagination, but for social control? Scary, right? Well, I'm going to examine a concept that I'm calling socialized traditionalism. It's the idea that what we call tradition, especially when it comes to things like gender and behavior, is not always just something old or natural. It's often taught, sometimes carefully, through stories, speech, and everyday interaction, and sometimes this is very intentional. Also, of course, just because something is old, that does not mean it is the most wise, and some traditional understandings of things deserve to get challenged over time because maybe they're outdated, and that's one of the reasons some of these fairy tales and just stories in general will change over time. Not always for better, not always for worse, depending on one's point of view. And of course, you've got the flip side of it. Just because something is traditional, it doesn't mean, you should just get rid of it. Some traditions probably are better than others, right? So let's look into this a little bit more. The fairy tale model, if you will. The Grimm brothers didn't just collect old folk tales, they actually reshaped them, perhaps sanitized them to some extent, and made them powerful tools for reinforcing middle class values. In stories like Cinderella, what we see isn't just a girl dreaming of a better life. We see gender roles being modeled with surgical precision. Girls are rewarded for passivity and domestic virtue. Boys, when they appear, they usually act out strength and autonomy. This isn't simply tradition, it's also very calculated social training within the story in a way. And this reflects a model of parental modeling where adults don't just tell children what's appropriate, they act it out. They socialize through behavior. Mothers model femininity, fathers model masculinity, and stories do the same on a cultural scale. And of course, there are exceptions to that. The the world at large often contradicts our mannerisms, and we often challenge gender roles even accidentally. It's one thing where it's really up to a person's perception. So, for example, when I grow my hair out longer, some people are a little more likely to mistake me for a woman or something like that. Something like that. It's happened. I have to admit that, and that's a little bit because people perceive the person with longer hair as possibly more feminine, right? And that's one of those strange quirks where there's no real merit to it, yet you can't fault somebody for possibly making that mistake. You might even, well, you might fault them a little bit. You might think they're stupid or something like that, but it is something that people are culturally trained into. And sure, you could be upset by it and all that kind of thing, but at the end of the day, society does kind of drill into people's heads that this type of symbol or this image represents this or that idea. That's how culture works. So again, I'm calling this socialized traditionalism. It's not necessarily ancient wisdom passed down untouched, but curated norms taught to children to maintain some version of social order. Now, of course, you can often have social chaos that springs forth out of this perceived social order because people might try to enforce the social order too rigidly, and that can actually lead to a society's downfall, really, if you think about it. And that's, again, why tradition is not just something that we should blindly cling to because, at what cost? To what extent do you need to defend a tradition or a perceived social order? And there's also the power of language and the critical window, if you will. I'm going to get into that. What does that mean? Well, socialization isn't just about content, it's about form, structure, and especially language. There's a fascinating connection here between how we learn to talk and how we learn to behave. Consider this: if a child isn't exposed to language early on in life, they may lose the ability to acquire it at all. And that's the critical period hypothesis, the idea that there's a window roughly from birth to age 7 when the brain is wired to absorb language naturally. Miss that window, and that ability might never fully develop. That's what happens in so called forbidden experiments, like with feral children raised in isolation without speech. The idea of the child who is raised by wolves. And I guess that actually has happened in a crazy case or two. Feral children actually are a thing. And in at least one case that I've heard about, they literally were raised by wolves. And I don't remember offhand which case that is, but I did read about it once. So I mean, you might roll your eyes and say, well, if you read about it, it's not true. But the crazy thing is, sometimes stories are true. And you know, if you are like a feral child, you can't just learn language like regular adults later in life. You know, because you don't have that capacity. Because adults raised under normal circumstances already have a working system in place. They're not building a brand new house, they're sort of remodeling what has already been there, right? And if you're a feral child who learns language too late, well, you're going to have a rougher time. Adults learn differently, more consciously, often relying on memorization and explicit grammar. It's slower and relatively native level, but it works because the neural scaffolding is already there. Take away that scaffolding, and you're gonna have a tougher time of things. And that brings us into the structure of storytelling, why stories and narratives are so important to the development of the understanding of the world and of language itself, and the nuances that we can contribute to reality if we properly understand language and stories. So, what does this have to do with Cinderella? Well, quite a lot actually, because oral storytelling, especially in pre industrial societies, wasn't just about tales, it was also about structure, about teaching people how to speak to one another and who had the right to speak first in some cases. So, these stories often included embedded rules of interaction, who addresses whom, in what tone, with what titles, and that's hierarchy in action, not just shown but performed. And part of that performance is through the storytelling method at hand. So when we analyze fairy tales, we shouldn't just look at the characters, we should also look at the grammar, the form, who speaks, who doesn't, who gets named, who gets silenced, all of that kind of stuff. You know, the kind of stuff that will have you sounding too much like a hyper feminist, but which is actually just how we are supposed to look at stories in the first place, right? It's it's funny because in order to properly understand a story, you almost have to politicize it to some degree. And that's one of the weird things about these people who say, I don't like politics in movies and TV shows," but there's always some sort of socialization going on, right? They're always in some ways reinforcing cultural values. And if you've been trained over time to say that certain things should never be talked about, well, you might want to ask yourself, well, why is that? Why am I thinking that way? You might want to check yourself before you wreck yourself, as the old saying goes. So, to bring it all together, what we think of as tradition is often the product of intentional teaching through stories, language, and model behavior. Of course, it's not all 100% intentional, but a lot of it is. And that includes the fairy tales we tell and the ways we tell them. They're doing more than entertaining, they're actually shaping us, oddly enough. So the next time you revisit Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, or any number of tales like that, ask yourself what's being taught here and who benefits. It again sounds like you're being some hyper feminist who's like maybe on a preaching rampage or something. But again, that's the sort of thing you have to do if you want to properly say that you analyzed a tale, that you looked at it in depth, you tried to understand the psychology of the characters to the extent that you can, and so on. Anyway, that's all for this episode of Critical Weight Theory, where again, I'm just thinking out loud. And if you enjoyed this, subscribe, hit the like button, share it, and check out, the the other episodes and all that. So yeah, I'm sure I'll be doing more stuff about learning and fairy tales and all that kind of fun stuff. So until next time, question the stories, especially the ones that seem harmless. Sometimes those ones might be the ones that inflict the most damage of all. That, well, maybe not, but I'm just trying to win some radical feminist cred here, perhaps. So anyway, have a good one.